They say that silence is golden, a peaceful harbor in a world of noise. But sometimes, silence is not peace. Sometimes, it is the quiet, methodical gathering of a storm, a patient hurricane that waits just beyond the horizon, biding its time until the perfect moment to make landfall and wash away everything in its path. For a man named Ethan Blackwood, his silence was never surrender. It was a promise, a vow whispered into the winds of a cruel past, a vow that was about to be kept. The air in the Willow Creek Town Hall was thick, with a desperation that felt older than the worn wooden walls. Murmurs of panic rippled through the crowd, the worried faces of farmers, shopkeepers, and families illuminated by the dull evening light filtering through the tall windows. They were gathered to face a ghost, a faceless corporate entity known only as Terra Firma Holdings. This invisible giant had, over the past year, systematically and silently acquired nearly every mortgage, every business loan, and every land lease in the entire valley. They were a town drowning in debt, and an unknown hand now held the power to either pull them from the water or push them under for good. Mayor Thompson was stammering at the podium, his words of reassurance falling flat, because everyone knew the truth: they were trapped. Then, a figure emerged from the shadows at the back of the hall. The crowd parted as he walked, his polished leather shoes making no sound on the dusty floorboards. He was dressed in a tailored suit that cost more than most of the cars in the parking lot, his posture radiating a cold, unshakable confidence. But it was his face that caused the whispers to die in people's throats. It was a familiar face, yet utterly transformed. The hunger and hurt that once defined his features were gone, replaced by a chilling calmness, an unnerving stillness in his dark eyes. His gaze swept across the room, lingering for a moment on a pale, beautiful woman in the front row, Sarah, and the arrogant man beside her, Marcus Thorne, before finally settling on the bewildered mayor. He reached the podium, and the silence that followed was absolute, heavy, and terrifying. He didn't need a microphone. His voice, when it came, was measured and clear, cutting through the tension like a shard of glass. "You are wondering who Terra Firma Holdings is," he said, the words simple, yet carrying the weight of a decade of unspoken rage. "You are wondering who holds the deeds to your homes, your businesses, your very futures." He paused, letting the fear marinate, letting them see the boy they once mocked in the powerful man who stood before them now. He was Ethan Blackwood. And as the full, horrifying realization dawned on every single person in that room, he delivered the final, devastating blow. Terra Firma Holdings is me. To understand the thunder of his arrival, you must first understand the 10 years of silent rain that preceded it. 10 years before the storm made landfall, Willow Creek was a town that prided itself on its tranquility. It was a picture postcard vision of small-town America, with white picket fences that gleamed in the afternoon sun, ancient oak trees that lined immaculate streets, and the gentle murmur of the creek from which it took its name. But beneath this serene surface, the town had a different kind of current, a silent, powerful undertow of judgment that could pull a person down without ever making a sound. In Willow Creek, you were not defined by the content of your character, but by the name of your father and the balance in your bank account. And by that measure, the young Ethan Blackwood was already drowning. He was a ghost haunting the edges of his own hometown. People saw him, but they didn't truly see him. They saw the grease permanently etched into the lines of his hands from his job at the auto shop. They saw the worn-out soles of his work boots as he walked the long road home because his rusty truck was, once again, out of gas. They saw the shadow of his father, a man the town remembered as a brilliant but foolish dreamer, an inventor who chased impossible ideas and left his family with nothing but debt and a legacy of failure. Ethan lived in that shadow, in a small, weathered house at the forgotten end of town, where the picket fences were gray and splintered. He worked 2 jobs, his days a blur of engine oil and sawdust, his nights spent poring over his father's old schematics and notebooks, trying to coax the spark of genius he knew was hidden there back to life. He was intelligent, fiercely so, but in Willow Creek, intelligence without wealth was just a curiosity, like a clever dog that could do a trick. The town treated him with a polite, corrosive pity that was somehow worse than outright scorn. Conversations would dip to a whisper when he entered the general store. The bank teller would sigh with theatrical impatience when he came to cash his meager paycheck. He was a constant, uncomfortable reminder of the failure they all feared, and they punished him for it with their dismissiveness. But Ethan had an armor against it all. His armor was Sarah. Sarah was the town's golden girl, the daughter of a well-to-do family, with eyes the color of the summer sky and a smile that could make the world feel right. And for reasons no one in Willow Creek could fathom, she loved Ethan Blackwood, or so he believed. To him, she was not just a girl, she was a sanctuary. When he was with her, the condescending glances and the whispered insults of the town faded into nothing. They would meet by the creek, away from the prying eyes, and she would trace the lines on his calloused hands, telling him they were the hands of a man who builds things, a man who would one day build them a future. She would listen for hours as he spoke of his father's designs, his eyes alight with a passion no one else ever saw. She made him believe that she saw the king inside the pauper, the brilliance inside the grease-stained mechanic. "Don't listen to them, Ethan," she would whisper, her head resting on his shoulder. "They're all trapped here. You're going to fly, and I'm going to be right there with you." He clung to those words like a prayer. They were the fuel that kept him going through the endless shifts, the lonely nights, the crushing weight of the town's low expectations. Of course, not everyone was enchanted by their romance. Sarah's mother, Eleanor, viewed Ethan as something one scrapes off the bottom of a shoe. She never spoke to him directly if she could help it, preferring to communicate through looks of pure, unadulterated disgust. She saw him as a stain on her daughter's pristine reputation, a low-class obstacle to the perfect match she had already arranged in her mind. And that match was Marcus Thorne. Marcus was everything Ethan was not. He was the heir to the Thorne fortune, the largest employer in the county. He drove a sports car that roared through the quiet streets. He wore clothes that were effortlessly expensive, and he walked with the lazy, unearned arrogance of a boy who had been handed the world on a silver platter. He wanted Sarah, not out of love, but out of a sense of entitlement. She was the prettiest girl, and he was the richest boy. In the simple, brutal arithmetic of Willow Creek, the equation was obvious. He saw Ethan not as a rival, but as an insect to be crushed. He and his friends would openly mock Ethan, their laughter echoing in the diner as they made loud jokes about his father's crazy inventions or the state of his house. Marcus would often pull up beside Ethan as he walked, revving his engine and sneering from the driver's seat. "Still playing in the dirt, Blackwood? A girl like Sarah needs a man, not a charity project." Ethan's fists would clench in his pockets, his jaw tight, but he would never give Marcus the satisfaction of a reaction. He would simply hold his head high and keep walking, his gaze fixed on the horizon, on the future Sarah had promised him. He endured it all, the sneers from Marcus, the venomous glares from Eleanor, the cold shoulders from the entire town, because he believed his love for Sarah made him invincible. He was a young man standing at the bottom of a mountain, convinced that the prize at the summit was worth the grueling, humiliating climb. He had no idea that the person he was climbing for was already standing at the top, waiting with Marcus, ready to kick him all the way back down. The workshop behind Ethan's house was less a building and more a museum of forgotten dreams. It was cluttered with the ghosts of his father's ambitions, half-assembled engines, strange metallic contraptions covered in dusty tarps, and blueprints that had yellowed with age and disappointment. Yet, for Ethan, this was a sacred space. Here, amidst the scent of oil and old wood, he was not just the town's charity case, he was an architect of the future. Every spare dollar he earned was poured into this sanctuary, buying salvaged parts and second-hand processors. Every spare moment was spent here, under the unforgiving glare of a single, bare light bulb that hummed late into the lonely nights. His only companion, the quiet crackle of the soldering iron. He was chasing one specific dream, the one he believed his father had been closest to grasping. It was a system for precision agriculture, a small, autonomous drone integrated with sophisticated soil moisture sensors. In a valley like Willow Creek, where life and death were dictated by the whims of rainfall and crop yields, it was revolutionary. It could save farmers thousands on water, dramatically increase their output, and predict blight before it ever took hold. It was a project born of love for a community that gave him none in return. More than that, it was the culmination of his father's genius, a way to finish the final sentence of a story everyone else had dismissed as a failure. He felt his father's presence in that workshop, a guiding hand on his shoulder, urging him to prove them all wrong. And through it all, there was Sarah. She was the light that found its way through the grimy workshop windows. She would slip out of her pristine family home and bring him flasks of hot coffee, her presence a warm counterpoint to the cold metal of his work. She would sit on a dusty stool, her bright dress a splash of impossible color in the monochrome world of grease and schematics, and she would listen. She was the keeper of his dream. He would explain the complexities of the drone's guidance system, and she would look at him with what he was certain was pure admiration. She helped him name it the Harvest, and she would speak of their future as if it were already built and waiting for them. "Just imagine, Ethan," she'd say, her voice a soft melody against the hum of machinery. "A beautiful apartment in the city, overlooking a park. We could travel. We'll come back here one day, just for a visit, and the look on Marcus Thorne's face when you pull up in a car nicer than his, it will be priceless." She made the dream tangible, painting it with such vivid detail that he could almost feel the plush carpet of their future apartment under his worn-out boots. Her belief became his own. When a crucial circuit board fried and he slumped in defeat, ready to surrender to the town's verdict on his life, she was the one who lifted his chin. "My mother asked me again today why I'm wasting my time with you," she told him, her eyes flashing. "I told her she was blind. I told her you were building a kingdom and I was going to be its queen." Her words were a potent balm on the thousands of tiny cuts he endured every day. She made him feel seen, valued, and destined for greatness. He wasn't just working for himself anymore. He was working for them, for the kingdom she spoke of. A kingdom far away from the petty tyrants of Willow Creek. The work was grueling. There were countless setbacks, moments where the delicate machinery refused to cooperate, where the code he'd spent a week writing collapsed into a meaningless jumble of errors. He was running on fumes, fueled by caffeine, sheer willpower, and the promises Sarah whispered in the dark. Then, one night, deep into the witching hour, something shifted. After weeks of trying to solve a complex power distribution issue, the answer came to him in a flash of insight. A final puzzle piece passed down from the ghost of his father. With trembling hands, he resoldered the connections, uploaded the revised code, and stepped back. He held his breath. He flipped a switch. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, a series of small, green lights blinked on in sequence. A low, steady hum filled the workshop, a sound more beautiful than any symphony. The drone, the Harvest, lifted off its platform, hovering perfectly a few feet off the ground, its sensors glowing softly in the dim light. Data began streaming to the cracked screen of his old laptop, accurate, stable, and flawless. It worked. It finally, truly worked. A wave of emotion so powerful it buckled his knees washed over him. It was the joy of creation, the relief of validation, the vindication of his father's name, all hitting him at once. He knew this was his one shot. He spent the next 2 days meticulously documenting everything, filming the drone in action, and compiling it all into a professional proposal. He found the email address for a top executive at a major agricultural technology firm in the city, a long shot he'd been holding onto for months. With his heart pounding in his chest, he used his last few dollars to pay for an hour at the town library's computer and sent the email. Then came the wait. Every day that passed was an agony of suspense. Every time he heard a car door slam, he thought it was Marcus coming to taunt him. Every time he saw his reflection, he saw his father's hopeful, haunted eyes staring back. He barely ate. He couldn't sleep. He was living in the space between two worlds, the one he was desperate to leave and the one he prayed would let him in. On the fourth day, an email notification appeared on his phone. The subject line read, "Regarding your proposal, the Harvest." He opened it, his hands shaking so violently he could barely read the words. "Mr. Blackwood, we are exceptionally impressed. Revolutionary potential. Our technical team is in agreement. We would like to fly you in for an in-person meeting next week to discuss a formal acquisition of your patent." The words blurred through a sudden film of tears. It wasn't a dream. It was real. The piece of paper, the golden ticket, the key to his kingdom was finally in his hand. A breathless, ecstatic laugh escaped his lips. He was free. They were free. And there was only one person in the world he wanted to share this moment with. He grabbed a handful of wildflowers growing by the roadside, their vibrant colors a mirror of the explosion of joy in his chest, and ran, faster than he'd ever run before, towards Sarah's house to tell her that their future had finally begun. The joy that propelled Ethan forward was a physical force, a current of pure, unbridled elation that made the familiar path to Sarah's house feel like new and undiscovered country. The world was suddenly rendered in high definition. The green of the leaves was greener, the blue of the sky was a shade he'd never seen before, and the simple wildflowers clutched in his hand felt like the most profound bouquet in existence. He was no longer Ethan Blackwood, the town's resident ghost. He was a creator, a success, a man who had wrestled a future from the jaws of a predetermined failure. The words from the email were a triumphant anthem playing on a loop in his mind. Exceptionally impressed, revolutionary potential, formal acquisition. These were the words that would unlock the cage. These were the words he would lay at Sarah's feet, the foundation stones of the kingdom he had promised to build for her. He imagined the scene over and over, the initial confusion on her face, followed by the slow dawn of understanding, then the explosion of shared joy, her arms around his neck, their laughter echoing through the perfectly manicured gardens of her family home. This single moment, he believed, would erase every sneer from Marcus Thorne, every disdainful glare from her mother, every whispered judgment from the town. This moment would be their beginning. He slowed as he approached the large, white house that had always felt like a fortress. Its immaculate lawn, a stark contrast to the untamed patch of earth he called his own. He wanted to savor it, to drink in the last few seconds of his old life before it was irrevocably changed. Instead of knocking on the front door, he decided to surprise her. He knew she loved to read on the flagstone patio in the back, surrounded by her mother's prize-winning roses. He crept along the side of the house, his worn boots silent on the soft grass, the bouquet of wildflowers held out in front of him like a sacred offering. As he rounded the corner, he heard her voice, light and happy, drifting through an open window. A smile touched his lips. He paused behind a large trellis, ready to step out and reveal himself, to present the miracle he held in his hands. But then he heard her laugh, and the sound froze him in place. It wasn't her usual, warm, gentle laugh. This one was different. It was sharp, brittle, and edged with a cruelty he had never heard before. And then he heard a name that made the blood in his veins turn to ice. "Honestly, Marcus, you have nothing to worry about." Ethan remained perfectly still, hidden by the leaves of the trellis. His heart, which had been soaring moments before, began to hammer against his ribs with a new, terrifying rhythm. "He's just so earnest," Sarah's voice continued, dripping with a condescending amusement that was utterly foreign to him. "He truly believes he's going to save the world with those little buzzing toys of his. He's been locked away in that filthy shed for months." Toys? Shed? The words were small, dismissive daggers. He could hear the faint, muffled sound of Marcus's voice on the other end of the line, and then Sarah laughed again. "Oh, I know. It was sweet, at first. A girl has to have a project, right? And I did feel sorry for him. But darling, it was always just a placeholder, a poor man's lottery ticket. I was never going to cash it in." The wildflowers in Ethan's hand suddenly felt like a bundle of thorns. The beautiful future he had been painting in his mind began to crack, the colors bleeding into a muddy, ugly gray. Every promise she had ever made, every whispered word of encouragement, replayed in his head, now twisted into the shape of a lie. The late-night coffee, the talks of their city apartment, the belief she had shown in him it was all a performance. He had not been her partner, he had been her project, her charity case. "Of course I'll marry you, you fool," she cooed into the phone, and Ethan had to physically clamp a hand over his mouth to keep from crying out. The world tilted on its axis, the sounds of the birds and the gentle breeze fading into a dull, deafening roar in his ears. Your father's ring is stunning. Mother is absolutely ecstatic. There was a pause, and then her voice dropped, becoming conspiratorial, a venomous whisper that carried all the way to his hiding place. Actually, speaking of the lottery ticket, something incredible happened. He got an email today. Some big tech firm in the city wants to buy his patent. He thinks it's our ticket out. She laughed, that same sharp, ugly laugh. He's probably on his way over here right now. The poor thing, ready to propose with a ring made of wire and weeds. It's almost sad. The roar in Ethan's ears intensified. He felt the strength drain from his limbs, his body turning to lead. This couldn't be her. This couldn't be the Sarah who had held his hand by the creek and promised him forever. But the voice was hers, and the final words she spoke confirmed the nightmare was real. "Don't you worry," she said, her tone all business now. "Let him come. I'll handle him. But you should talk to your father. Daddy always says an idea is worthless until the right person owns it. We need to figure out how to make sure we're the right people." The conversation ended. He heard the click of the phone, followed by the soft, cheerful humming of a girl who had just secured her future. For a long, silent minute, Ethan didn't move. He stood behind the trellis, a statue carved from disbelief and agony. His entire world, the foundation of his hope, the very reason for his struggle, had been a carefully constructed lie. He wasn't the hero of the story, he was the fool. He looked down at the vibrant, cheerful wildflowers in his hand. A moment ago, they had represented a new beginning. Now, they were just weeds. His hand went slack. The bouquet fell from his grasp, scattering across the perfectly manicured lawn, a splash of wild, pointless color on a landscape of pristine deceit. He didn't confront her. He didn't shout or scream. There were no words for this kind of devastation. Silently, he turned and walked away. The triumphant run had become a funeral procession for a life that had never existed. Every step was heavy, each breath a painful reminder of his own suffocating naivety. When he finally reached his own small, weathered house, he saw it for what it truly was, not a workshop of dreams, but the cage everyone in Willow Creek had always said it would be. The silence that fell over him then was not golden. It was the deep, cold, and absolute silence of a heart that had just stopped beating. The numbness that followed Ethan home from Sarah's house was a merciful anesthetic, a thick fog that dulled the edges of his new reality. He spent the rest of that day and the following night in his workshop, sitting motionless in the dark, staring at the silent, elegant form of the harvest. The drone, his beautiful creation, now seemed to mock him. It was a monument to his own spectacular blindness, a testament to a love that had never been real and a future that was now a pile of ash. The email from the tech firm remained unanswered. The wildflowers he had dropped lay wilting on Sarah's lawn. The world had moved on, and he was trapped in the wreckage of the moment he learned the truth. He felt nothing, thought nothing. He was simply a hollowed-out shell, waiting for a wind to come and blow him away. But the wind that was coming was not one of chance. It was a carefully orchestrated gale, designed to tear him apart completely. While Ethan sat in his stupor, the gears of power in Willow Creek began to turn against him. A plan, as cruel as it was efficient, was being put into motion. It began with Marcus Thorne, who saw Ethan not just as a humiliated rival, but as a loose end. A man with a potentially valuable patent and a story to tell was a liability. He went to his father, Richard Thorne, a man who had maintained his family's dominance over the valley for decades by understanding one simple principle: threats must be neutralized before they have a chance to grow. For the Thornes, this was not personal. It was business. It was pest control. Sarah, in a final, chilling act of self-preservation, played her part. She tearfully told her mother and Marcus that Ethan had become unstable. After she ended their relationship, that he had made threats, that she was scared of what he might do. She painted a picture of herself as a victim, a damsel who needed protection from the obsessive fantasies of a poor, spurned lover. The narrative was set. The stage was being dressed for the final act of Ethan Blackwood's life in Willow Creek. The next morning, Ethan forced himself to go to his job at the auto shop. He needed the money, but more than that, he needed the mindless routine, the familiar weight of a wrench in his hand, anything to distract from the screaming void inside him. He moved through the day like an automaton, his colleagues giving him a wide berth, sensing the bleak aura that clung to him. He was tightening a lug nut on a tire when the shadow fell over him. He looked up to see two sheriff's deputies standing there, their faces grim. One of them was a man who had coached his little league team. The other had a son in his grade at school. They were not strangers, and yet they looked at him as if he were. The entire garage fell silent, the only sound the hiss of an air compressor winding down. Across the street, leaning against the polished fender of his sports car, was Marcus Thorne, a smug, satisfied smirk playing on his lips. And a little further down, emerging from the dry cleaner's shop at that precise moment, was Eleanor, Sarah's mother. She paused, bringing a hand to her chest in a gesture of feigned shock and delicious, theatrical pity. "Ethan Blackwood," the first deputy said, his voice flat and official. "You're under arrest for the theft of private property." Ethan stared at him, the words failing to register at first. "Theft?" He looked from the deputy's impassive face to the owner of the shop, Mr. Henderson, who was standing by the office door, refusing to meet his eyes. The accusation was absurd. He had never taken so much as a paperclip. "What are you talking about?" Ethan's voice was a hoarse whisper. "I didn't steal anything." The deputy simply pulled out a pair of handcuffs. "Mr. Henderson here has filed a report. Says you've been stealing tools and electronic components for months to build that drone thing of yours in your shed." The lie was so audacious, so perfectly crafted, that Ethan could only stare in stunned silence. It discredited him, it explained his invention away as the product of a crime, and it cemented his status as the town's villain. As the cold steel of the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, a small crowd of onlookers gathered, their faces a mixture of curiosity and condemnation. This was the moment they had all been waiting for. The Blackwood boy, just like his father, had finally crashed and burned. He was no longer a sad story, he was a spectacle. The holding cell was cold, damp, and smelled of despair. This, Ethan thought, was the bottom. There was nowhere left to fall. He was a thief, his love was a lie, his dream was stolen. His name was mud. He was ready to give up, to let the system they had built swallow him whole. It was in that moment of absolute surrender that a key turned in the lock. Standing there was Ben, a quiet boy he'd known since childhood. Ben had been an outcast too, a gentle soul in a town that valued aggression and wealth. He had taken his entire savings, a meager few $100s, and posted Ethan's bail. "You have to go, Ethan," Ben whispered urgently as they stood outside the sheriff's station in the encroaching twilight. "You can't stay here. My uncle is a clerk at the courthouse. He said the Thorns have already spoken to the judge. You won't get a fair trial. They're going to make an example of you." The last of Ethan's shock finally evaporated, replaced by a sudden, terrifying clarity. Ben was right. This was not a fight he could win. Not yet. Under the cover of a moonless night, Ben drove him back to his small, weathered house for the last time. He had 10 minutes. He moved with a feverish purpose, the numbness replaced by a cold, burning rage. He ignored his clothes, ignored the few sentimental objects he owned. He went straight to the workshop. He carefully packed his father's notebooks, the repository of a lifetime of genius. He took the hard drive that contained every schematic, every line of code, every piece of research for the harvest. He took the drone itself, dismantling it with practiced speed, and packing it into a large duffel bag. These were not mementos. They were evidence. They were weapons. As he stood at the edge of town, waiting for the pre-dawn bus that would take him to the anonymous sprawl of the city, he looked back at the sleeping silhouette of Willow Creek. It looked peaceful, idyllic, a perfect small town. But he knew the truth. He knew about the rot beneath the surface, the vipers that hid in the manicured gardens. He wasn't running away in defeat. He was making a strategic retreat. As he stepped onto the bus, leaving the only home he had ever known behind, he made a silent vow. He would not forget the smug look on Marcus's face, the coldness in Sarah's voice, or the condemning eyes of the town. He would disappear, he would grow strong in the shadows, and one day he would return. And when he did, he would not come for justice. He would come for everything. The city Ethan arrived in was a roaring, indifferent beast made of steel, glass, and a million lonely souls. It swallowed him whole. He stepped off the bus into a cacophony of sirens, shouting, and the endless rumble of traffic, a boy with nothing but a duffel bag containing a broken dream and the clothes on his back. In Willow Creek, his poverty had made him a spectacle. Here, it made him invisible. He was just another ghost haunting the periphery, one of the countless faces you see but never register. This anonymity, which should have been terrifying, became his shield. No one here knew the name Blackwood or the shame attached to it. No one looked at him with pity or contempt. They didn't look at him at all. He was free from his past, but he was also utterly, crushingly alone. The first few years were a brutal lesson in survival. He washed dishes in the steamy, foul-smelling kitchens of restaurants he could never afford to eat in. He worked construction, hauling steel beams on skeletal skyscrapers that pierced the clouds, the wind whipping at him, a constant reminder of how far he could fall. He lived in a room in a forgotten burrow, a space so small and damp that mold grew in the corners, a place where he slept with the dull ache of exhaustion in his bones and the cold fire of hatred in his gut. But this hardship did not break him. It forged him. Every condescending boss, every night spent hungry, every moment of brutal labor became another log on the fire of his vengeance. The memories of Sarah's laughter and Marcus's smirk were a relentless furnace inside him, burning away the soft, hopeful boy he used to be, leaving behind something harder, sharper, and infinitely more dangerous. He was not just surviving, he was studying. He watched the flow of money, the dynamics of power, the casual cruelty, and the rare moments of kindness. The city was his classroom, and its curriculum was the unforgiving reality of human nature. After 2 years of backbreaking labor, he found his way in. It was a menial job, cleaning floors at a small, struggling robotics firm called Stern Dynamics. It was here, amidst the scent of industrial solvent and the hum of servers, that his real education began. He would finish his work and then linger, reading discarded technical journals, studying the schematics left on whiteboards, absorbing the language of innovation that was spoken all around him. He was a ghost here too, but a ghost that listened. His silent diligence did not go unnoticed. Jacob Stern, the company's owner, was a brilliant, cantankerous engineer in his late 60s, a man who had seen his own genius squandered by poor business decisions. He saw something in the quiet janitor who read advanced robotics theory in his break time. He saw a familiar, obsessive fire in Ethan's eyes. One evening, Stern, frustrated with a critical flaw in a guidance system that his own engineers couldn't solve, found Ethan staring at the problematic schematic. On a whim born of desperation, he grumbled, "You think you're so smart? Figure that out." The next morning, a revised schematic, elegant and perfect, was waiting on Stern's desk. It was the beginning of a strange and powerful alliance. Stern became the mentor Ethan never had. He plucked him from obscurity, gave him a workbench, and threw impossible problems at him. Ethan solved every single one. Stern taught him about engineering, but he also taught him about the world. "Talent is worthless, kid," Stern would say, his voice raspy from too many cigarettes. "It's leverage that matters. Never show them what you have until you're in a position to make them pay for it." Under Stern's guidance, Ethan resurrected the harvest. He took it apart and rebuilt it from the ground up, integrating Stern's more advanced technology, making it 10 times more efficient, and patenting it under a new, anonymous corporate shell. They didn't sell it. Following Stern's cynical advice, they licensed the core technology, the revolutionary guidance and power systems to dozens of companies across a multitude of industries. The money that came in was not a flood, it was a tsunami. But Ethan had no interest in the trappings of wealth. While other men his age were buying cars and chasing women, Ethan was in Stern's office, learning his mentor's final, most important lesson: how to make money multiply. He attacked the financial markets with a terrifying, inhuman focus. He wasn't investing, he was hunting. He consumed data, tracked global trends, and developed algorithms that could predict market shifts with uncanny accuracy. He bought failing companies and stripped them for assets. He invested in obscure biotech and emerging technologies. His fortune grew with a silent, explosive force, a vast and invisible web of assets managed by a labyrinth of holding companies. He was a ghost in the machine of global capitalism, a myth whispered about on trading floors, a faceless entity known only by the devastating precision of his moves. 10 years passed. The boy who fled Willow Creek in the night was gone, erased completely. In his place stood a man who was a stranger even to himself. He lived in a stark, minimalist penthouse that overlooked the city, a cold glass tower that seemed to float above the rest of humanity. He owned nothing personal. There were no photographs, no mementos. His suits were tailored, his diet was disciplined, his routine was rigid. He had forged his body and mind into weapons. The warmth and hope that had once defined him were cauterized, leaving behind only a cold, clear purpose. Jacob Stern was his only human contact, a partnership built on mutual profit and a shared disdain for the world. One evening, Ethan stood before a floor-to-ceiling screen in his office. On it was a complex map of his financial empire. With a simple gesture, he dismissed the intricate charts of stocks and assets and zoomed in, and in, and in again, until a single, tiny, insignificant dot in a forgotten corner of the country filled the screen. Willow Creek. He had spent a decade in the wilderness, gathering stone and steel, sharpening his claws, and building his kingdom in the shadows. The boy had been banished, but the man had returned to the gates. The period of silent preparation was over. It was time to collect his debt. The first act of Ethan's war was not a declaration, but a quiet, meticulous creation. In the sterile legal world of corporate law, an entity was born. He named it Terra Firma Holdings, a name steeped in a brutal, private irony. He would offer them the illusion of solid ground just before he opened the earth and swallowed them whole. The company was forged, not like a business, but like a weapon. Its headquarters was a post office box in Delaware. Its ownership was a masterful nest of legal Russian dolls, a series of anonymous shell corporations and impenetrable blind trusts, each one leading to another, the trail finally vanishing into the legal fog of offshore accounts. The world's best lawyers, paid exorbitant sums for their silence and their skill, crafted a corporate entity that was, for all intents and purposes, a ghost. It had immense financial power, but no face, no history, and no discernible master. It was the perfect instrument for a man who had learned the devastating power of operating from the shadows. Ethan was its god, an invisible prime mover, his will executed by proxies and cutouts who never knew for whom they truly worked. With his weapon forged, Ethan began the second phase: reconnaissance. Vengeance, he had learned, was not a crime of passion. It was a masterpiece of planning. He did not want to simply wound Willow Creek. He wanted to dismantle it, piece by piece, with the cold precision of a surgeon. To do that, he needed a flawless anatomical chart of his enemy. Through Jacob Stern, he hired a discreet firm of corporate intelligence specialists, a team of former financial regulators and forensic accountants who were experts at navigating the murky depths of other people's secrets. They were given a single, clear objective: to build a complete and comprehensive dossier on the town of Willow Creek, from its municipal balance sheets to the private debts of every single one of its prominent citizens. They were told their anonymous client had a keen interest in regional investment. They asked no other questions. They knew their only job was to deliver the truth, and they were paid a fortune to find it. For months, information flowed back to Ethan's penthouse, data streams of encrypted files and confidential reports that he consumed with an obsessive, detached focus. He learned everything. He saw the financial statements of Thorne Enterprises, the tax records of the mayor, and the credit reports of the sheriff. He mapped the web of loans and favors that connected the town's elite. He read summaries of hushed-up local scandals, of business deals soured by greed, of quiet family disputes over land and inheritance. He saw the town not as the idyllic postcard of his youth, but as a living organism, and with his team's help, he was identifying every one of its vital organs and all of its underlying diseases. He cataloged the names and faces of those who had wronged him, their lives reduced to a series of numbers on his screen, their assets, their liabilities, their dependencies. It was a cold, clinical vivisection of the society that had so casually cut him out and left him to die. And through this mountain of data, a single glaring vulnerability emerged, an Achilles heel more perfect than he could have ever hoped for. The town was rotting from the head. The Thorne family, under the increasingly arrogant and reckless leadership of Richard and his son Marcus, had become a parasite. For years, they had been using their own businesses, and by extension the town's economic stability, as collateral for a series of disastrous, high-risk real estate ventures in faraway states. They had encouraged the townspeople to take on debt, to mortgage their homes and businesses to the hilt, all while funneling the profits from the town's labor into their own failing empire. Willow Creek was a house of cards, built on over-leveraged loans and the blind trust the community had placed in its most powerful family. They were on the verge of collapse, and they didn't even know it. This discovery was, for Ethan, a profound moment of vindication. His revenge was no longer just a selfish act of personal retribution. It was a necessary correction, a cleansing. The Thorns were a disease, and he would be the cure. With the battle plan finalized, terra firma began its silent invasion. The campaign started not with a bang, but with a series of quiet, unremarkable banking transactions. Agents of terra firma, operating through third-party investment firms, approached the large, regional banks that held Willow Creek's debt. To these city banks, the small-town loans were trivial, a nuisance on their books. They were more than happy to sell them off, especially when terra firma offered to pay cash, asking for a modest discount for the bulk purchase. The acquisitions were slow, methodical, and deliberately scattered. One week, they would buy a batch of agricultural loans in the county. The next, a portfolio of small business debts from a neighboring state, a portfolio that just happened to include the loan for the Willow Creek diner. The mortgage for the home of the deputy who had handcuffed him was bought from a bank in one city, the loan for the auto shop that had fired him from another. Each purchase was a single, untraceable thread. But Ethan, sitting in his glass tower high above the world, was weaving those threads into a noose. Slowly, painstakingly, the ownership of Willow Creek's financial soul was transferred into his hands. The final, master stroke, was the acquisition of the town's municipal bonds from a struggling pension fund looking to liquidate assets. With that single transaction, Ethan Blackwood went from being the town's outcast to its primary creditor. He owned the debt on their roads, their school, their fire department. He owned them. On the large screen in his office, the map of Willow Creek began to change. With each acquisition, another property, another life, was shaded in the deep crimson of terra firma's logo. The board was now his. The pieces were all in place. And his opponents, sleeping soundly in their beds, still had no idea that they were even in a game. For the first few months, life in Willow Creek continued on its placid, predictable course. The acquisitions made by terra firma holdings were silent, buried in the paperwork of distant banking institutions. But then, the first tremors began. They were small at first, easily dismissed as administrative errors or a change in policy. Old Man Hemlock, a farmer who had worked the same plot of land for 60 years, received a letter about his tractor loan. For decades, he'd had a casual understanding with the local bank manager. He paid when the crops came in. But this letter, printed on heavy, cream-colored paper and bearing a logo of a stylized, unyielding tree, was not from the local bank. It was from terra firma holdings, and its language was cold, precise, and absolute. Payment was due on the first of the month, no exceptions, no grace period. Across town, at the diner, Maria Flores found that the generous line of credit she used to buy supplies each week had been frozen pending a financial review by the new owner of her loan, a company she had never heard of. The town's mechanic, Mr. Henderson, who had so eagerly helped frame Ethan, had his business loan reassessed. His variable interest rate, stable for years, suddenly ticked upward by 2 full points. These were isolated incidents, but they were straws in a wind that was beginning to blow cold. The whispers started at the post office, in the pews after Sunday service, and over coffee at the diner. The name terra firma was on everyone's lips, a strange, foreign-sounding name that felt out of place in their small world. It was a ghost. No one knew who they were or where they were from. All they knew was that this new, invisible landlord was nothing like the ones they were used to. The familiar, handshake-based economy of Willow Creek was being replaced by something rigid, impersonal, and unforgiving. There was no one to call, no one to reason with. There was only the address in Delaware and the dispassionate, legally binding words on the page. A quiet, creeping anxiety began to settle over the town like a winter fog. People started looking at their neighbors with suspicion, wondering who else was in trouble, who else had received a letter. The easy credit and casual debts that had lubricated the town's social and economic life for years were now becoming chains, and an unknown entity was beginning to rattle them. At the Thorne Mansion, the grandest house in the valley, the fog of anxiety was thicker than anywhere else. Richard Thorne, a man who had ruled Willow Creek like a feudal lord for 30 years, was a caged lion, roaring with impotent rage into the telephone. His lines of credit, once seemingly infinite, were being systematically restricted. His long-term business partners were suddenly hesitant, citing concerns about his debt-to-asset ratio, concerns that seemed to spring out of nowhere. He demanded to know who was behind terra firma, but his oldest and most powerful contacts in the banking world came back with nothing. The company was a fortress of legal anonymity. Marcus, meanwhile, was struggling to maintain his facade of effortless superiority. He was living a life he and Sarah had built on the assumption of endless resources, but the well was suddenly running dry. He was juggling calls from anxious investors while simultaneously trying to placate suppliers who were now demanding cash on delivery. The pressure was immense, and it was making him volatile and secretive. He felt as if he were being stalked by a predator he could not see, a presence that was methodically cutting him off from his money and his power, isolating him from the very empire he was meant to inherit. Sarah felt the shift not as a direct financial blow, but as a change in the atmosphere of her own home. The life of idle luxury she had betrayed Ethan for was beginning to feel brittle. A shopping trip to the city ended in the quiet humiliation of a declined credit card. The lavish charity gala she was planning had to be postponed due to what Marcus vaguely described as cash flow issues. He was drinking more, his temper shorter, his nights filled with restless pacing in his study. When she pressed him for answers, he would lash out, telling her not to worry her pretty little head about it. But she did worry. She heard the name, that strange name, whispered between Marcus and his father in tense, angry arguments. Terra firma. It meant nothing to her, and yet it felt strangely significant, like a word from a half-forgotten dream. The solid ground she had so carefully secured for herself was beginning to tremble, and she was haunted by the terrifying feeling that she was standing on a fault line. High above the city, in a silent, sterile penthouse, the ghost in the machine watched his work unfold. Ethan was not gloating. He felt no thrill, no joy. He approached the dismantling of Willow Creek with the detached focus of a demolitions expert. On a massive screen, he monitored the town's vital signs, the flow of capital, the rising number of late payment notices, the frantic communications between the Thornes and their bankers. Every piece of data confirmed his strategy was working. The anxiety was building, the pressure was mounting. He would issue quiet, simple commands to his legal team. The Flores Diner loan. Enforce the late payment penalty clause. Initiate a formal audit of all Thorne Enterprise subsidiaries. Deny Mayor Thompson's request for a renegotiation of the municipal bond repayment schedule. Each command was a small, precise turn of the screw, another strand in the invisible net being pulled taut. He was not just attacking their finances. He was waging a psychological war, isolating them, turning them inward, forcing them to confront the fragility of the world they had built. The first sign that the net was drawing blood came a week later. A going out of business sign appeared in the window of the town's oldest bakery, a family-run shop for 3 generations. The townsfolk stared at the sign in stunned silence. This was no longer just a series of administrative headaches. The ghost was real, and it had just claimed its first soul. The quiet, creeping anxiety that had haunted Willow Creek for months finally gave way to raw, naked terror. The change was as swift as it was brutal. The letters from Terra Firma Holdings, once formal but manageable, were replaced by something else entirely. They were official legal documents, thick envelopes delivered by certified mail, their contents speaking a language of finality and ruin. The words, "Notice of Foreclosure" and "Asset Seizure" were a death sentence printed in cold, black ink. The first notice was hammered onto the weathered oak door of the Hemlock Farm. The sound of the bailiff's hammer echoed through the valley, a drumbeat signaling the beginning of the end. Within days, the notices spread like a plague. A bright red sticker appeared on the glass door of the bakery. A legal notice was taped to the front of the auto shop, its text stark against the greasy windows. The general store, the diner, the small family homes on Maple Street, one by one, they were marked for death. The invisible net was no longer invisible. It was now a shroud descending over the town, and its victims were beginning to suffocate. Panic ripped through the community, tearing apart the delicate fabric of trust and neighborliness that had held the town together for generations. The diner, once a place of easy gossip and shared coffee, became a tense chamber of whispered fears and accusations. Families who had known each other for a century now looked at one another with suspicion, wondering who would be next, who was secretly negotiating, who would be the one to fall. Friendships fractured under the strain of called-in personal loans. The desperate, primal instinct for self-preservation took over, and the community dissolved into a collection of terrified individuals, each fighting to keep their own head above the rising water. They blamed the mayor for his incompetence. They blamed the banks for selling them out. And most of all, they blamed the Thorns, whose greed had led them all to the slaughterhouse. The town that had once been united in its contempt for Ethan Blackwood was now consuming itself in a frenzy of fear and recrimination. Nowhere was the fall more spectacular or more public than at the Thorn mansion. The fortress of their arrogance became a theater of their humiliation. The moving trucks arrived on a bright, sunny morning. The company logo, an obscene splash of color against the backdrop of their ruin. Under the watchful, pitying, and sometimes secretly satisfied gaze of the townspeople, the symbols of their empire were hauled out into the open. The Italian marble statues, the antique furniture, the grand piano that Sarah had loved, all of it was inventoried, tagged, and loaded onto trucks by indifferent men. Sarah stood on the porch, a ghost at her own funeral, watching the life she had sold her soul for being dismantled piece by piece. The foundation of her world, the absolute certainty of wealth and status that she had chosen over love and loyalty, was a lie. It was all gone. She was left with nothing but the crushing weight of a catastrophic miscalculation. Marcus was a broken man. The swagger and arrogance were gone, replaced by a frantic, hollow-eyed desperation. He made endless phone calls, pleading with former allies who no longer answered, his voice cracking with a weakness he had once so mercilessly mocked in others. The final, bitterest irony came when their lawyer informed them that their home had been sold to cover a fraction of their debts. The buyer was an anonymous investment trust, represented, of course, by the law firm that also represented Terra Firma Holdings. Stripped of their wealth and their dignity, reduced to the same level as the people they had once ruled, the Thorns and the town's other panicked leaders decided on one last, desperate gambit. At a chaotic and angry town meeting, where accusations flew like stones, Mayor Thompson, his face pale with sweat, pounded his gavel for order. "We cannot hide any longer," he shouted, his voice trembling. "We cannot let this faceless entity pick us off, one by one." He proposed they do something bold, something defiant. He proposed they call a public town hall meeting and formally, publicly, invite a representative from Terra Firma Holdings to attend, to face them, to explain the reason for this brutal assault. It was a cry of desperation, a prayer screamed into a storm. Marcus Thorn, seeing a final, pathetic chance to reclaim a shred of his former authority, staggered to his feet to second the motion. He declared that they would stand together and demand answers, that the people of Willow Creek would not be broken. The motion passed with a roar of desperate, fearful approval. The invitation was drafted that very day, a formal, legalistic challenge, and sent overnight to the anonymous post office box in Delaware. It was an act of defiance born from absolute hopelessness, a final, desperate attempt to look their executioner in the eye. Miles away, in the silent, climate-controlled air of his penthouse, Ethan Blackwood watched a digital copy of the invitation appear on his screen. His face remained a mask of calm, his expression unreadable. His network of information had, of course, alerted him to the town's plan long before the letter was even sent. Everything was proceeding exactly as he had calculated. Their panic, their chaos, their futile act of defiance, it was all part of his design. They believed they were setting a trap for a monster, forcing a ghost to show its face. They had no idea that they were simply sending an engraved invitation for their own judgment day. He had spent 10 years in the shadows, a ghost in their machine, an invisible hand guiding their fates. Now, they were begging him to step into the light. With a slow, deliberate movement, he instructed his secretary to draft a reply. The message was simple, polite, and chilling in its affirmation. A representative would be pleased to attend. He leaned back in his chair, the city lights twinkling like a galaxy of fallen stars below him. The game had been long, the board was set. And it was, at last, time for the king to reveal himself. The Willow Creek Town Hall was filled to the point of overflowing, its air thick with the scent of fear, anger, and a desperate, flickering hope. Every seat was taken, and people stood 3 deep along the walls and in the aisle. They had come to face their monster. They had spent weeks living under the tyranny of a faceless corporation, and tonight they were promised a face. Mayor Thompson stood at the podium, trying to project an image of a leader in control, but the sweat beading on his forehead betrayed his terror. Beside him, a gaunt and hollow-eyed Marcus Thorne sat slumped in a chair, a deposed king forced to witness the sack of his own city. In the front row, Sarah sat ramrod straight, her knuckles white as she clutched her purse. She had dressed with defiant elegance, a last, futile act of asserting the status she no longer possessed. The entire town was a powder keg of raw emotion, waiting for the spark. They were expecting a lawyer from the city, a cold corporate suit they could shout at, a villain they could rally against. They were not prepared for a ghost. "We are here tonight," the mayor began, his voice amplified by the microphone, "to demand answers. We have formally invited a representative from Terra Firma Holdings to address the citizens they are attempting to destroy. Is there a representative present?" A tense, expectant silence filled the room. All eyes scanned the crowd, searching for a stranger in an expensive suit. For a long minute, there was nothing but the sound of anxious breathing. The hope in the room began to curdle back into despair. They had been foolish to think the monster would show itself. Then, from the shadows at the very back of the hall, a figure began to move. A slow, deliberate walk down the central aisle. A path cleared before him as people turned, their faces shifting from confusion to stunned, slack-jawed disbelief. The murmurs started at the back and rolled forward like a wave. Is that? It can't be. Blackwood's boy? It was Ethan. But it was not the boy they remembered. The hesitant, grease-stained youth was gone. This man was sharp, cold, and radiated an aura of absolute, unshakable power. His tailored suit hung on him not as a costume, but as a second skin. His eyes, cold and dark, swept over the crowd, acknowledging no one, yet seeing everyone. He reached the stage, ascended the 2 short steps, and stood beside the trembling mayor at the podium. He did not look at the crowd. He did not look at the mayor. He looked directly at Marcus, and then his gaze settled on Sarah. The entire hall held its collective breath. The silence was so profound it felt like a physical weight. "You asked for a representative of Terra Firma Holdings," Ethan said, his voice calm and measured, needing no microphone to carry to every corner of the room. "You wish to see the face of the entity that holds your future in its hands." He paused, letting the impossible truth sink into their minds. "Here, I am." He let the statement hang in the air for a heartbeat and then delivered the final, devastating blow. "Terra Firma is me." The reaction was not a shout, but a single, collective gasp, a sudden intake of air, as if the entire town had been punched in the gut at the same moment. Sarah's face, already pale, turned the color of ash. Marcus looked up, his expression one of pure, uncomprehending horror, like a man seeing his own tombstone. Ethan let the shock ripple through them, a master of timing, a conductor of their despair. He turned his attention back to Sarah, his voice dropping slightly, becoming more personal, a stiletto sliding between her ribs. "You once told a friend of yours that I was a poor man's lottery ticket," he said, the words precise and devoid of emotion. "You said you were waiting, but that you were never going to cash it in. You were right about one thing, Sarah. It was a lottery, and I won." He swept his arm out, a gesture that encompassed the entire, terrified assembly, "and all of you are the jackpot." He then looked at Marcus, whose face was now slick with sweat. "You called me a charity project. You used to ask me if I was still playing in the dirt. Look at you now, Marcus. Stripped of your father's stolen money, sitting in a hall full of people who despise you. Who is the charity project now?" But this was not just about emotional retribution. It was about the restoration of truth. "Before we discuss the new terms of your existence here in Willow Creek," Ethan continued, his voice returning to its cold, commanding tone, "we have some old business to attend to. The matter of my departure, 10 years ago." He gave a slight nod to a man in a dark suit, sitting in the third row. A large projection screen descended from the ceiling behind him. "You have all lived for a decade under the belief that I am a thief, that I was disgraced and ran away in shame." The screen flickered to life, showing not a video, but an audio file, a waveform pulsing like a heartbeat. "The truth is, I was framed." He pressed a button. A voice, coarse and full of guilt, filled the hall. It was the voice of Mr. Henderson, the owner of the auto shop. The recording was crackly, clearly made in secret. "I swear, I never wanted to do it," Henderson's voice pleaded. "But Marcus Thorne came to me. He said his father would ruin me if I didn't play along. He told me what to say to the sheriff. He and Sarah, they planned the whole thing. They said Ethan was unstable, that they needed to discredit him before he hurt someone. They brought the tools themselves from Thorne's own workshop and had me claim they were mine. God forgive me, I was a coward." The recording ended. An absolute damning silence followed. The town now saw the truth, a truth far uglier than they had imagined. They had not just misjudged a poor boy, they had been willing accomplices in a vicious conspiracy, led by the very family they had revered. The last shred of the Thorne family's honor turned to dust and blew away. Ethan stood before them, not just as their creditor, but as the living embodiment of their collective guilt, his name finally, brutally, and publicly cleared. The judgment had been rendered. Now, all that was left was the sentencing. The silence that followed the recording was a thick, suffocating blanket of shame. The townspeople could not look at Ethan, and they could no longer look at each other. They finally looked at Marcus and Sarah Thorne, and for the first time, they saw them not as fallen royalty, but as the architects of a petty, vicious crime that had poisoned their town for a decade. Marcus stared at the floor, a man hollowed out, the last of his pride gone. Sarah was openly weeping, not tears of remorse, but of the pure, selfish agony of total, irreversible ruin. But Ethan did not allow the silence to linger. He was not finished. He took a slow breath, and the entire room leaned in, sensing that the final, heaviest blow was yet to fall. "What you just heard," Ethan began, his voice once again a calm, resonant instrument of judgment, was about the theft of my future, about the clearing of my name. It was a necessary piece of business, but it was not the reason I am here. That was for the son. His eyes scanned the crowd, finally landing on the ashen face of Richard Thorne, who had been rushed to the meeting from his home and now sat slumped in a wheelchair in the front row, his face a mask of slack-jawed disbelief. "This," Ethan said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying an immense weight, "is for the father." The screen behind him flickered again. The audio waveform was replaced by a series of scanned, black and white photographs. The first showed two young men, arms slung around each other's shoulders, smiling in front of a half-assembled engine. One was a handsome, confident Richard Thorne. The other was Ethan's father, his eyes alight with a brilliant, hopeful fire. My father and Richard Thorne were not just neighbors, Ethan narrated, his tone that of a historian reciting a forgotten tragedy. They were partners. They were friends. My father was the genius, the dreamer. Richard was the pragmatist, the salesman. Together, they were going to change the world. Another image appeared on the screen. A page from his father's notebooks, covered in elegant, complex equations and detailed schematics. The date was clearly visible in the corner, years before Thorne Enterprises was ever founded. Then, another document appeared beside it, an early internal memo from the newly formed Thorne Enterprises outlining their flagship product. The designs were identical. My father trusted his friend, Ethan continued, his voice never rising, yet each word was a hammer blow. He shared everything, every breakthrough, every design. But Richard saw an opportunity not for partnership, but for plunder. He began to systematically steal my father's work, filing patents under his own name. He used his family's money to build a company, while simultaneously casting my father as an unstable, unreliable eccentric. He ruined his friend's reputation to cover his own theft. Ethan gestured to the room around them. This town, the prosperity you all enjoyed, the jobs Thorne Enterprises provided, it was all built on a lie. You weren't living in a town built by a great businessman. You were living in a house built by a very successful thief, on a foundation of intellectual property he stole from my father. He let that sink in. The final, devastating truth. The Thornes were not just bullies. Their entire legacy was a fraud. And the final, beautiful piece of justice, Ethan said, a flicker of something almost like a smile touching his lips. The project that Richard could never quite understand, the one set of notebooks he couldn't get his hands on, was my father's most ambitious work, a side project he called The Harvest. He looked out at the sea of broken, horrified faces. The patent that created terra firma, the seed of the fortune that has just bought and paid for every last one of you, was the last untainted piece of my father's soul. He couldn't be here to claim his victory, so he sent me instead. With that, the history lesson was over. The trial was complete. Now came the sentencing. Ethan's gaze softened slightly as he addressed the rest of the town. For most of you, he said, your punishment has been the fear you have felt for the last few months. You are guilty of willful blindness, of reveling in the misfortune of a family you believed was beneath you. That ends tonight. New lease and loan agreements will be drafted by my lawyers. The terms will be fair, stricter than you are used to, but manageable for those who are willing to work honestly. This town is no longer a playground for the corrupt. It is now a place of business. You will pay your debts, you will live honestly, and you will remember the truth of how this place was built. Then, his face hardened as his eyes fell upon Marcus and Sarah. For you two, the terms are different. You will not be allowed to leave. Fleeing would be too easy an escape. He looked at Marcus. You took such pleasure in my poverty, in the grease on my hands. You will now learn the dignity of honest labor. Starting tomorrow, you will be a member of the Willow Creek Municipal Maintenance Crew. You will patch the roads, you will clear the garbage, you will landscape the town square. You will be paid a minimum wage, and you will work, in public, under the sun, until I am satisfied that you understand what it means to truly earn your keep. Marcus simply stared, his mouth hanging open, a broken puppet. Ethan then turned to Sarah. Her weeping had subsided into silent, convulsive shudders. And you, Sarah, he said, his voice utterly devoid of hatred or love, a voice of pure, cold transaction. You built your life around the fear of being ordinary, of having to serve others. Your new life begins tomorrow at 6 a.m. You will be a waitress at the Willow Creek Diner. You will take orders, you will pour coffee, and you will clear tables for the very people you once held in such contempt. Your wages will pay the rent on the small, two-bedroom house on the edge of town that I will be leasing to you both. He looked at them, the two people who had shattered his world, now completely and utterly his to command. You will live in a house I own. You will work jobs that I control. Your survival will be at my discretion. Every day, for the rest of your lives here, You will be a living monument to the consequences of your own choices. You wanted to rule the world. Instead, you will simply be a part of mine." He gave a final, sharp nod. His business concluded. He turned away from the podium, from the shattered lives and the stunned silence of the town he now owned, and walked back down the aisle, his footsteps the only sound in a world he had just remade. The judgment was final. The story of the Thorns was over. The story of Willow Creek and its new formidable lord had just begun. Months passed. A strange, quiet order settled over Willow Creek. The town breathed again, but it was a different kind of air, cleaner but colder, stripped of the comforting illusions of the past. The Reign of the Thorns was a story told in hushed tones, a cautionary tale for a new generation. The new Lord of the Valley was a ghost, an invisible presence whose will was executed through fair but inflexible contracts. His justice was visible every day. The townspeople would see Marcus Thorne in his bright orange safety vest, his face perpetually turned towards the ground, silently patching the asphalt on the same roads he once roared down in his sports car. They would go to the diner and be served by Sarah, her movements mechanical, her eyes vacant, a beautiful porcelain doll whose inner light had been extinguished. They were living specters, constant, public reminders of the price of betrayal. Ethan did not live there. He had taken over the old Thorne mansion, not as a home, but as a regional office for his vast empire, a cold monument to a victory that brought him little warmth. His work in Willow Creek was, for all intents and purposes, done. It was on a crisp autumn afternoon, during the final legal liquidation of the last of Richard Thorne's assets, that his lawyer brought him a dusty, forgotten box from the back of a storage locker. "It's mostly old personal effects, correspondence," the lawyer said, placing it on the vast mahogany desk that had once been Richard's. "I thought you might want to see it before it was all incinerated." Ethan was initially uninterested. His war was over. He had no desire to sift through the ashes. But as the lawyer was about to leave, a particular envelope, its paper yellowed and brittle with age, caught his eye. It was addressed simply to Richard, and the elegant, familiar handwriting was unmistakably his father's. A black stamp in the corner read, "Return to sender." Address unknown. It had been sent, but never received or perhaps never accepted. With a strange sense of reverence, Ethan slid a letter opener through the seal. The letter inside was not what he expected. There was no rage, no accusations, no pleading. It was a letter of profound, heartbreaking disappointment. "Richard," it began, "I know what you have done. I know you have taken my work and claimed it as your own. I imagine you believe you have won, that you have secured a future for your family at the expense of mine. My heart does not break for the loss of the patents, my friend. It breaks for the loss of you. The man I knew would have celebrated our success together, not stolen it in the dark. The wealth you are chasing will build you a house, but it will never build you a home, for a home must have a foundation of honor." Ethan's hands began to tremble slightly as he read the final paragraph. "Even now, it is not too late. Our friendship is worth more than this invention. Tear up the false patents. Let us file them together, as we always planned. Let us build a legacy our sons can be proud of. It is not too late to choose a different path, Richard. I pray you will find the courage to do so." The letter fell from his fingers onto the polished desk. In that moment, Ethan understood. His father had not been a failure. He had not been a weak man who allowed himself to be cheated. He had been a king, a man of such immense character that his first instinct in the face of devastating betrayal was to offer a hand of forgiveness, to salvage the soul of his friend rather than the profits of his invention. Richard Thorne's greatest theft was not the patents. It was the opportunity for grace that this letter had offered, an opportunity he had clearly rejected. Ethan's own methodical 10-year campaign of revenge suddenly felt small. It had been just, it had been earned, and it had been flawlessly executed. But it was a path of cold, hard justice, the path of a lesser man than his father. He had won by becoming as ruthless and calculating as his enemies, and the victory, he finally admitted to himself, was hollow. He had reclaimed his family's honor, but he could not reclaim the quiet, noble grace that had been his father's true fortune. Later that evening, Ethan stood on the hill overlooking Willow Creek, the same hill where he had once dreamed of a future with Sarah. The town lay before him, a kingdom bought and paid for, its lights twinkling in the dusk. He felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a vast, quiet emptiness. He had proven them all wrong, but he had lost himself in the process. He had silenced the ghosts of his past, but now he had to face the silence of his own future. He thought of his father's letter, of his own 10 years of cold, simmering rage, and the final lesson of his long journey settled upon him. He spoke the words aloud, a whisper to the wind, a verdict for himself and for all who would listen. Never, ever underestimate the silence of a man who has endured too much. For when he finally speaks again, it will not be with words, it will be with a sentence. His business here was truly finished. He turned away from the view and walked to his car. He did not look back. As the powerful, silent engine carried him away from Willow Creek and onto the dark, open highway, he was not driving towards his sterile penthouse or his financial empire. He was driving towards an unknown horizon, a future that was, for the first time in a decade, not defined by the past. The story of Ethan Blackwood's revenge was over. But the consequences, like the ripples from a stone thrown into a still creek, would spread forever. Every story of betrayal has its end, but a story of justice is always a beginning. I am Gia Din US, and I will be back with another verdict. Wait for it.